The title of this talk is Strategy Without Strategizer. So in the last talk, I focused more on the specific policy proposals, both long-term and short-term, in FALC and Degrowth. In this talk, I'll be kind of focusing less on FALC and more on kind of left accelerationism a bit more generally. And I'll be focusing, instead of specific policies, more about the strategies that are important to creating an environment where it's even possible to put these policies in place. Okay. So both left accelerationism and degrowth call for very radical changes in the ways that our economies function. And in doing so, they both succeed in constructing very utopian visions. But if for many of us it's easier to imagine an end to the world than an end to capitalism, then these utopias tend to be not as uplifting as you would think. So I think what can be more motivating for many people at this point is a discussion of practical tactics and strategies. So when it comes to left accelerationism, which I'll define kind of loosely in this talk based on Nick Cernick and Alex Williams' 2015 book, Inventing the Future, as the call to seize control over and accelerate automation and other technologies that, in combination with redistributive and well-being-oriented policies, would then create a post-work, post-scarcity society beyond capitalism. Political strategy is definitely worth discussing. This is because the philosophy of political strategy in left accelerationism is actually kind of, I would say, a more defining feature than its utopia itself. So the mode of politics that it proposes separates it both from right and unconditional accelerationism and also from the folk politics of the left in both their theories of how we will reach the futures that they envision. So drawing on Reza Negarestani's criticisms of right accelerationism, Alex Williams points out that Nick Land's singularitarian future depends on an algorithmic paradigm of recursive computation. And this is distinctly inadequate, he says, to match the continuous processes that we find in nature, where nonlinear feedback leads to infinitesimally small differences in initial conditions, and this generates then a vastly different and divergent result over time. The continuous nature of reality, he writes, escapes the quantized grasp of our present computational paradigm. And that paradigm rests at the core of Land's machinery of acceleration, a unidirectional accumulative process of algorithmic amplification. Folk politics, on the other hand, as Cernick and Williams define it, similarly retreats from this complex, continuous nature of reality and allowing its political action to be shaped more by folk psychological conceptualizations of the world, so viewing political issues on these smaller, more cognizable scales of the local, and also privileging short-term direct actions, which are then based on more intuitive ways of thinking about cause and effect. So in short, it's also an approach that's not adequate to do the difficult work of creating systemic change to navigate towards a future beyond capitalism. So left accelerationism theorizes this complex terrain that the movement will have to navigate in order to build power by combining insights from cybernetics and complexity theory with Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci's theory of power as hegemony. In Gramsci's theory, systems like capitalism don't hold power purely through coercion or violence, but instead, in addition, by installing a new set of common sense values which are based on ideologies that justify these systems. So in this way, people ultimately consent to the power of the hegemonic order. In an essay that was published this year called Strategy Without a Strategizer, from which this talk takes its title, Alex Williams builds on this concept by drawing out the ways in which Gramsci's hegemony reflects the patterns and processes of complex systems. He writes, power, from the hegemonic perspective, is the result of all the different kinds of interactions and forces within a given system. These interactions and forces shape it. They give power its own character and dynamics irreducible to that out of which it emerges. So he's quoting here political theorist Jonathan Joseph. The word emerges is particularly crucial for Williams here, and he expands on this word to make the case that hegemony is therefore an example of what philosophers of complexity describe as weak emergence. While ultimately capable of being tracked back to the actions of human beings and the environments they exist in, Hegemony is a kind of large-scale pattern that has a relative autonomy from the elements which gave rise to it. Hegemonic power, in this sense, is not in the hands of one person, but is distributed, abstract, and much more than the sum of the parts that created it. And it shapes the world in complex ways that are not under anyone's total control. What does this understanding of hegemonic power mean for those who hope to challenge it, contest it, and ultimately bring an end to it? Williams seeks to apply the same logic for understanding the complexity of hegemony to the complexity of counterhegemony and the form of strategy necessary to achieve it. Just as power is not concentrated in the hands of a single system, the leadership of a counter-movement cannot be centralized in the hands of one person either. Counter-hegemonic strategy must be as complex as the dominant order that it seeks to challenge. Williams writes that in a counter-hegemonic project, we would not find a singular centralized strategizer, a lone genius, or an inner council, but rather a dispersed yet relatively localized web of broadly aligned organizations, coordinating action through nodes rather than absolutized command hierarchies. This is one way, he writes, in which we can understand the notion of hegemonic projects as strategy without a strategizer. So, rather than a unitary singular body that undertakes counter-hegemonic strategization, Williams suggests that strategy can accumulate across an ecology of organizations and is not vested in any single actor. Williams' hypothesis is then that coordination would emerge partly from explicitly articulated propositions and plans, but also from non-intentional processes. This is what Gramsci referred to as being a matter of spontaneous attraction. In this way, Williams suggests strategy can emerge as partly the result of runaway autocatalytic processes, developing their own momentum beyond an initial impetus. From this perspective, strategy continually emerges out of the interactions between the agents of a counter-hegemonic project. In this way, left accelerationism argues against creating a specific blueprint for its utopian movement. Instead, it puts forward an understanding of strategy to challenge hegemonic orders that grasps the way in which these orders themselves gained power. So it's fighting fire with fire, so to speak. Left accelerationism models this approach on the success of neoliberalism, which successfully replaced the Keynesian paradigm in political economy with new ideas about free market capitalism. But what struck me the most in reading about this theory of counter-hegemonic strategy was the similarity to the ways in which the degrowth movement operates and has done so over the past decades. So for this talk, I'll define degrowth as the left movement led by activists and academics to downscale production and consumption in wealthy global north countries and restructure society around well-being and human flourishing through top-down as well as bottom-up changes. And these range from minimum and maximum income, de-enclosing common pool resources, as well as rapidly expanding the use of beneficial technologies like renewable energy, but also rapidly scaling back or even abolishing technologies and practices that do not improve social or ecological well-being. In this way, degrowth seeks to end capitalism and create a post-growth society in its place. Degrowth challenges capitalism's common sense about infinite economic growth and, like left accelerationism, it is a counter-hegemonic project that is working to install a new set of common sense values, bringing new ideas about social and ecological justice into mainstream discourse. It seeks to do so not through hierarchical organizations, but through a decentralized network of different organizations, actors, and allies from other political struggles. It operates not with a set blueprint, but by embracing a strategic pluralism, understanding itself as a movement of movements. In what follows, we'll take a closer look at the framework for emergent, partially autonomous modes of counter-hegemonic strategy that left accelerationism proposes, and I want to consider the affinities between these theories and practices and those seen in degrowth. The goal here is to explore not only how far along left accelerationism and degrowth are in achieving their strategic goals as movements, but also to consider the extent to which degrowth's development is a kind of test case for the strategies that left accelerationism proposes, given that it's a little bit further along in its development. My feeling is that degrowth might offer a few more insights than what we gain when we just look to neoliberalism's path. This is because while neoliberalism's success in replacing an older hegemonic order While this is definitely illustrative, at the same time, it's a shift from one capitalist paradigm to another capitalist paradigm. And the task for left accelerationism or degrowth is to replace a capitalist paradigm with something that definitely isn't capitalism. This is a much more monumental and much more challenging shift to make. So Sept and Williams propose 3 minimum requirements for a counterhegemonic movement. These are a mass populist movement that forges class unity. This also includes then a healthy ecosystem of organizations which give a movement leadership, coordination, stability over time, and also help concentrate resources. And thirdly, important is points of leverage, so points of political or economic power, they write, in inventing the future, that can be used to compel others to adapt to the interests of a particular group, such as the strike or blockade. Without these leverage points, they write, change can only come about when it is in the interests of the powerful. So how do these 3 components compare across left accelerationism and degrowth? While past left movements focused on the working class as their main political subject, Sept and Williams correctly observed that this approach is no longer realistic today. The fragmentation of traditional groups of resistance, they write, and the generalized decomposition of the working class mean that there is no pre-existing group that would embody universal interests or constitute the necessary vanguard of this transformative project. Instead, a pluralistic approach to mass support is necessary, ensuring that a variety of struggles for social justice and human emancipation could see their interests expressed in left accelerationism. Inventing the Future identifies 4 political struggles that could be united in the pursuit of a post-work world. These are environmentalism, feminism, anti-racism, and post-colonial and indigenous struggles. So even in its early stages, left accelerationism has seen success in finding the relevance of its project for feminism and anti-racism, and this is due largely to the efforts made not by Sept and Williams, but by other theorists that speak to left accelerationism from their positions within these 2 struggles. So this is what Gramsci would call organic intellectuals. These theorists have worked to challenge and expand left accelerationism through discussions of xenofeminism and black accelerationism. These discussions then lay the foundations for broader activist efforts that unite the fight for post-work automation with the goals of queer feminist and anti-racist political struggles. But on the fronts of environmentalist and post-colonial and indigenous movements, the potential to win a mass support for left accelerationism through theoretical contributions or through broader activism remains questionable, I think. There are significant contradictions between the goals of these movements and the goals of left accelerationism, and these contradictions might be too stark to unite even under a very pluralistic strategy. The current absence of organic intellectuals from environmental justice and indigenous rights movements in the global north and south in left accelerationist circles seems to attest to this. Having existed as a dual activist and intellectual movement since the early 2000s, Degrowth is a little bit further along in articulating the different groups and struggles that can constitute its own political vanguard. In the online publication Degrowth and Movements, 20 different political struggles that see their goals reflected in degrowth were mapped out, and post-colonial and indigenous movements are strongly represented in this. This owes perhaps to the fact that alliances between these struggles and degrowth is firmly embedded in the movement's theoretical foundations, which sees critical ecological economics as something deeply tied to struggles for social and environmental justice against imperial extractivist forces of the global north. This is then reflected in the numerous collaborations between degrowth projects and researchers in the global north with environmental justice organizations in the global south, as well as other research collaborations. So for example, last year marked the first North-South Degrowth Conference, which was held in Mexico City. Likewise, feminist political struggles also find integrations with degrowth goals, and feminist thinkers have offered some vital critiques to the movement so that they're more inclusive to these perspectives. At the same time, however, these are predominantly cis feminist perspectives, and this represents a really big gap in the articulation of degrowth, something that should definitely be addressed. Much ecofeminism does tend towards transphobia and can even be trans-exclusionary, so a degrowth feminism must not go down the same path. Moreover, degrowth theorists, like those in left accelerationism, do seek to create space for anti-racist struggles in their movement, but there are major gaps here too, and this is an issue that legal scholar Brian Gilmore and the researcher Sam Bliss have both written about as a barrier to degrowth in the US context. So in addition to a lack of active anti-racist theorizing in degrowth, we also see this gap in the way that degrowth futures often run the risk of being swallowed up by white middle-class desires, so artisanal goods at local farmers markets, and the kind of broader aesthetics of what we might call bourgeois primitivism. So finally, the degrowth perspective, being necessarily anti-capitalist and also a left movement since its inception, has been able to successfully articulate its position in alignment with other left struggles. But it is nevertheless rejected sometimes by some socialist and even some eco-socialist positions. This is because growth logic and productivism does not just define capitalism, but also large parts of left theory, and this does create a point of tension. But ongoing debates in this space suggest that this is also changing, and a wider integration of degrowth on the left does seem likely. So this mapping of alliances between a left post-work or post-growth movement and existing political struggles then informs the development of what Cernick and Williams point to as the second necessary component of counterhegemonic strategy, and this is the ecology of different organizations. So while folk political approaches, according to Cernick and Williams, sought to apply the logic of a single organizational form across an entire social and political field, so the workers' union or the cooperative, they note that every successful movement has been the result not of a single organizational type, but of a broad ecology of diverse organizations. Left accelerationism then seeks to engage a pluralism of forces that are able to positively feedback on their comparative strengths and relate to each other in a decentralized and networked manner. But they should also include hierarchical and closed groups as elements of the broader network. So to this end, 4 main types of organizations are identified as crucial in inventing the future. These are media organizations, intellectual organizations, labor organizations, and the state. While past left movements have typically created their own media organizations, Cernick and Williams emphasize the importance of left accelerationism being able to build a presence in mainstream media. This is also a goal shared by Degrowth, which has its own numerous volunteer-run media outlets and networks, but has also sought to gain increasing visibility in mainstream media since the early 2000s. So if we take a mainstream, albeit left-leaning outlet like The Guardian as a kind of test case to compare the two, we can see that coverage of left accelerationist perspectives has been featured more and more in recent years, although this is usually in the form of book reviews or reporting on its perspectives as a kind of separate movement. Degrowth has also had a presence in mainstream media and, in this example, also in The Guardian for a longer amount of time. And it appears less as book reviews, but more as a kind of frame that's used by journalists to comment and reflect on different events. So in the 2000s, this was often in debates about the ills of capitalism and the future of economic growth and well-being. But then increasingly in the 2010s as a kind of way to respond to the worsening of the global climate crisis. If left accelerationism can become a frame in the same way, we could then expect to see it incorporated more frequently in mainstream media as a way to make sense of things like automation, the risk of technological unemployment, decreasing quality of life, decreasing wages and increasing working hours under capitalism, and also to inform general critiques of the current economy. And there are also a few examples of pieces in the press like this already. However, the lack of more overt confrontation with the climate crisis in left accelerationism means that it's not likely that it'll be used as a frame for these kind of stories, which are increasingly dominating news cycles as a topic that larger sections of the population are looking to the media for answers and guidance for as we begin to feel the effects closer to home and also as the global youth protest movement grows. Equally important as presence in the media is the expansion of left accelerationist ideas through intellectual organizations. As Cernick and Williams write, in a world of complexity, no one has a privileged view of the totality. Thus, a healthy intellectual sphere will involve intellectuals with multiple perspectives, as well as multiple forms of intellectual organizations ranging from They say think tanks, to captive university departments and other educational institutions, as well as more loosely organized training and consciousness-raising bodies. The projects taken on by these organizations should also be diverse, encompassing on-the-ground inquiries, as well as detailed analysis of local power networks, with also a greater number of intellectuals devoted less to immediate and pressing concerns and more to the development of long-term proposals. So that means new ways of organizing and understanding the economy. This requires highly technical knowledge and long-term research, they write. And of course, I'm quoting, such work also needs to be fed back into the networks of political actors and social narratives to gain its full effect. Though the arts do not get much attention in inventing the future, the book, at least, Left Accelerationism, seems to so far have had the most success among intellectual organizations in the arts, design, and adjacent philosophy and cultural theory communities, so in departments at Goldsmiths and other UK universities, in the faculty at Struggle School, as well as in circles around platforms and publishing houses like eFlux, other intellectual communities online and offline around left theory presses like Verso. In terms of think tanks, the Research Institute Autonomy, as well as the New Economics Foundation, both of these are in the UK, are developing post-work policies in line with the proposals by Cernick and Williams. I'm not currently aware of other similar organizations, but would be interested to know if you guys know any about them. So by comparison, Degrowth, I would say, shows a stronger presence at universities, not only in the UK, but also in Europe, particularly Southern Europe, as well as in North America, and it has specific research clusters, think tanks, and education programs. Unlike left accelerationism, degrowth researchers have a wider reach in academia with positions across a wide range of departments spanning natural and social science disciplines, and importantly, economics, which is one of the fields identified by left accelerationism as having particular importance in challenging the hegemony of neoliberalism. Interestingly enough, degrowth has a somewhat smaller presence in the arts, design, and cultural theory communities where left accelerationism dominates. The monopoly held by left accelerationism in these spaces is something I'm personally interested in changing, just for the sake of diversity, if nothing else. But we can also see a shift occurring here, looking to this year's Oslo Architecture Triennale and their rigorous engagement with degrowth as an example. I also expect to see more collaborations between degrowthers and arts and design theorists and professionals, as well as increasing visibility for degrowth researchers from a design background. So while Cernick and Williams take a critical stance towards labor unions, they consider them to play a vital role in building up a counterhegemonic ecology of organizations. They argue that today's struggling and often corrupt unions will be better served, I'm quoting, by refocusing towards a post-work society and the liberating aspects of a reduced working week, job sharing, and a basic income, not least because this may help them resolve differences between ecological movements and organized labor, as the emphasis on productivity increases for more free time, rather than increased jobs and output, can help bring these groups together. However, for reasons explored in my last talk, this emphasis on productivity increases across the board in our economy is very difficult to reconcile with an ecological agenda, as an emerging consensus shows that as we overshoot our ecological and resource limits, we need to produce overall less and not more with more efficiency. Nevertheless, Cernick and Williams make an important point about goals for increasing human well-being, and not just increasing jobs and output as being something that both unions and left environmentalists can build alliances upon. This is actually the approach of the degrowth movement in its strategy for engaging with unions. But as the entry on unions from the Degrowth in Movements book that I mentioned earlier shows, their hypothesis about this potential alliance is actually very difficult to put into practice. Degrowth has found partnerships with a few unions so far, and while German unions such as IG Metall also advanced the debate around refocusing the economy on well-being and not profit in the 70s, this discourse was then pushed back by political agendas of economic growth, and so today's unions usually align themselves with this economic growth agenda for specific strategic reasons. The fact that a post-work left accelerationist future does still aim at overall productivity increases and doesn't attack economic growth directly might actually put them in a better position to build alliances with labor unions, but they wouldn't be able to achieve this environmentalist alliance that they envision. So this brings me to the fourth organizational type that's important for building counter-hegemonic power, and this is the state. As Cernick and Williams correctly point out, while the nature of international capital and the interstate system make radical change virtually impossible from within, there remains important policy choices to be made about austerity, housing support, climate change, and more. And they write that to reject parliamentary politics is to ignore the real advances that these policies can make. For this reason, left accelerationism seeks to build its counter-hegemonic project through work in the policy space, and we can already see successful outcomes from these efforts. So this week it was announced by the UK Labour Party that they would aim to shift Britain to the 32-hour working week, and this is in line with a proposal put forward by the autonomy think tank and the New Economics Foundation as part of their post-work campaign, and I think that Nick Cernick was also involved in this. Degrowth has seen some similar victories in the past, but also defeats. And this reminds us that a counter-hegemonic project will typically see ups and downs in the policy sphere. In past decades, the German Greens Party and the EU had released different policy documents that advocated for degrowth or degrowth-like policies, but these proposals did not gain momentum, and this underlines the fact that the hegemonic order of unending economic growth very much holds sway over politics today. More recently, degrowth research and demands were included in the Green New Deal for Europe report, which is currently being put forward to the European Parliament. This report, which is available online, presents policies that don't pursue the impossible goal of decoupling increasing economic activity from environmental impact, but instead they are, quote, designed to decouple human flourishing from economic growth, ensuring that we can transition to a society where well-being is not determined by ever-increasing production and consumption. At the intergovernmental level, degrowth scenarios have been incorporated into last year's and this year's IPCC reports on climate mitigation. But at the same time, the recent OECD report, Going for Growth, rejects post-growth in favor of the green growth narrative. So in spite of increasing influence in the policy sphere, degrowth does still face a lot of challenges in gaining support in this space. I want to finish up this section of the talk with a fifth organization type that we should also consider, namely grassroots organizations. So left accelerationism in seeking to emphasize the importance of the above four organizations while reducing the left's what they think is an excessive focus on grassroots efforts. They do imply that grassroots should still play a role, but they don't articulate clearly what this diminished role should be. As the degrowth movement shows, grassroots initiatives can play an important role in supporting not just the development of a new common sense of a counter-hegemonic project, but also giving it a real, concrete manifestation in our communities. So Cernick and Williams point out that both hegemonic and counter-hegemonic projects aren't just based on pure ideology. They also take material forms. So the materialized reality of neoliberal capitalism is seen in the way that our cities and our infrastructure work and shapes our daily lives. And these material hegemonies can create a powerful path dependency or lock-in. And this is where it's really difficult to challenge the current hegemonic order with just ideas when these material structures exist all around us. So Cernick and Williams argue that left accelerationism should build a socio-technical counter-hegemony, so both in the spheres of ideology and ideas, but also in the sphere of material infrastructures. So at the heart of the degrowth movement is the creation of material alternatives at the grassroots level. And this is under the banner of non-reformist reforms. So this means reforms that don't seek to improve the existing system, but seek to materialize the goals of a different system in our world now. This is also referred to as utopias or commoning or communization, and the degrowth movement supports and is supported by local level grassroots activism in these kind of material projects, so eco-villages, transition towns, worker cooperatives, community gardens, local currencies, and so on. These projects also serve as sites as awareness raising and alliance building with different political struggles, and they are also sites for active research and experimentation, which then feeds into works in how we theorize degrowth, and this then feeds into degrowth policy proposals. So while left accelerationism is right to emphasize a plural ecology of organizations rather than a narrow focus on the grassroots, the movement's counter-hegemonic project would probably benefit if it extended this critique of the grassroots rather than saying it needs a diminished role and leaving open questions as to what this role should be. They could ask then what a grassroots project would look like and how it would fit in their counter-hegemony in a kind of material and experiential way, and how these projects could then create feedback loops with the other organizations in the ecology of left accelerationist power building, in the same way that they do in the degrowth movement. Okay, so points of leverage are the third most important and most difficult to achieve in building counter-hegemonic power. Seizing control over leverage points through blockades and factory strikes is one of the major ways in which a counter-hegemonic project can compel powerful forces to adapt to its interests. Otherwise, they have to rely on their proposals being in the interests of the powerful. So while Sept and Williams take neoliberalism as their model for hegemonic change, they admit that the project of neoliberalism is very different to theirs. Neoliberalism had the advantage of benefiting many people in power and aided the wealthy to become even wealthier. So it did not need to rely as much on such leverage points, but it could make do with its power of persuasion. At the same time, a contemporary counter-hegemonic project is faced with very few viable leverage points today. As Sept and Williams point out, the challenge facing strikes for a post-work politics is seen in the fact that due to many reasons, we have dwindling amounts of workers, so automation being one of the reasons. But there are also alternatives. They suggest that in some factories, even a very small amount of workers might be enough to disrupt activity. You can also do strikes where you invite the wider community to occupy a workplace. And you can also blockade leverage points in retail distribution and logistics systems, so ports or major freeways. And you can also develop new skills in sort of blockading information technology infrastructures upon which expanding automation depends. So I'm not sure if there have been yet strikes or blockades in the name of or just in alliance with left accelerationism. I have seen photos of protesters with placards demanding fully automated luxury communism. And again, I'd be interested to know in the discussion that we'll have after if anyone knows of this happening. In any case, it's crucial, according to Sept and Williams, that these actions are situated within a larger strategic plan, otherwise they risk becoming just temporary movements that erupt only to disappear without a trace. Where does degrowth stand on the question of leverage points? As we've already discussed, the alliances between degrowth and unions leaves more to be desired. But striking and blockading leverage points are still defining characteristics of degrowth's counter-hegemonic project. Over the years, the movement has built up a special relationship with environmental justice praxis, so building alliances with activists that occupy the frontiers of extractivism. In Germany, there's a very close relationship between the degrowth movement and the anti-coal movement. So that's embodied by groups like Ende Gelände. And this relationship has even been described as a very special love story between theory and praxis, which I think is really nice. Degrowth is also developing a relationship with the Fridays for Future school strikes movement. So on the evening here, before the most recent global strike, a discussion was held as to whether Fridays for Future should also call for degrowth as part of its demands. Another space where we see degrowth activists placing pressure on these leverage points is in the burgeoning degrow aviation movement, where the expansion of airports is also protested through sit-ins and strikes. There are also a lot of smaller protest actions at various leverage points, from factories to infrastructure projects, and this is an integral part of the tradition of degrowth conferences and summer schools that happen across Europe, North America yearly. And then finally, alliances such as the Green Anti-Capitalist Front also integrate critiques of economic growth in their wider critiques of capitalism. And I do think it's likely that we'll see degrowthers supporting and participating in these important civil disobedience efforts that happen at crucial leverage points in major cities. So while contemporary workplaces and a complexifying economy do diminish leverage points for political action, these growth economies also constantly create, for worse mainly, they create lots of new sites of extraction and environmental destruction. And this is, I think, the ultimate embodiment of the violence of economic growth. So degrowth does then seek to use these sites as leverage points, and this will strengthen its counter-hegemonic praxis, and then further the strong and mutually beneficial relationship between theory and action and degrowth. So as we've seen, there are strengths and weaknesses in left accelerationism and degrowth when it comes to building power through mass support, through ecologies of organizations, and through the use of leverage points. But there are also some more fundamental barriers to building counter-hegemonic power that both movements face, and I want to talk to these now. So to do this, I think we need to move away from the framework that's set up by Sept and Williams to a more general frame of hegemony that's used in critical political economy. The semi-autonomous processes that are identified by Sept and Williams are actually just one of 4 prerequisites that are necessary for a paradigm shift in which one hegemony is replaced by another. So according to this broader Gramscian framework, the first prerequisite for a successful counterhegemonic project is a deep crisis of the existing system and the prevailing political, economic, and cultural paradigm. A counterhegemonic project must also develop then a coherent set of alternatives to this crisis or crises, and this is a second prerequisite. So on one hand, this seems kind of obvious and seems like something that both movements fulfill, but I do think it's worth looking at them more closely. So we've seen many similarities in the strategies proposed and used in left accelerationism and degrowth, but it's in the identification of these crises and their positioning towards them, and in the alternatives that they develop that these two movements diverge significantly. This divergence then points us to two different foundational challenges that they both face in terms of strategy. So left accelerationism presents itself as an alternative to the multiple crises of capitalism. One of these is, of course, climate change, but the problem of technological unemployment arguably receives greater priority. The alternative that left accelerationism proposes does not seek to entirely undo the conditions creating this crisis, but true to accelerationist principles, seeks to repurpose and transform these crisis-inducing technologies and bring them under the control of a fairer socialist, system. There are many ways that you can critique this move, including from an ecological perspective, which was more the subject of my last talk, but I'd like to focus now on what this means for strategy. Stanek and Williams admit that it's very difficult to gain access to key leverage points, as we saw, and to use them effectively, and building mass support will also be challenging. But as it stands, their counterhegemonic project does not actually present a strong or confrontational critique of the hegemony of growth and its purported benefits. It does pay lip service to this critique, but I wouldn't say it does anything else. And there is actually an advantage to be gained from not being antagonistic to the regime of economic growth. It is much easier in this case to win footholds and funding for intellectual organizations. It's much easier to build alliances with growth-oriented labor unions, and above all, it's a lot easier to get a platform in the policy sphere. But this is a kind of double-edged sword. So if degrowth theory is right, and economic growth is essential to capitalism, and it's the driving force behind its exploitation, then failing to oppose economic growth means that left accelerationism can suffer from a strategic disadvantage. And this is the risk of being co-opted into capitalism. In Gramsci's theory of hegemony, this is called transformismo, so it's a strategy of assimilating and domesticating potentially dangerous ideas by adjusting them to the policies of the dominant coalition and thereby obstructing the formation of class-based organized opposition to establish social and political power. Left accelerationism may be anti-capitalist, but does its willingness to repurpose not only existing technologies, but also the function of them, which is increasing productivity. I guess the question is, does this make their theory too easy then to integrate back into capitalism, which, as we know, is highly adaptive? Then for degrowth, the strategic challenge that they face in the diagnosis of the crisis and their presentation of their alternatives to it is somehow the opposite. So by directly attacking not only capitalism as the source of the climate crisis, but the paradigm of economic growth upon which capitalism depends, degrowth places itself in a very weak position. So arguably, unlike left accelerationism, the only option it has is to undertake this very complex, pluralistic, and network strategy in the hopes of at some point shifting the Overton window on growth and creating better political conditions for social ecological transformation. The continuing difficulty of this has led some in the degrowth movement to actually question the effectiveness of this decentralized, pluralistic strategy that left accelerationism has such high hopes for. So in a series of recent online articles, degrowth theorists debated the future of strategy for the movement. Some argued that its own strategic indeterminacy and its unstructured character should continue, but others called for more centralization. So this would be in the building of political parties, perhaps, or by developing an international organization with different chapters. And this would be much, much more structured than how the movement works today. So this might not seem too appealing, but we can also question whether this kind of partially autonomous strategy of neoliberalism, which left accelerationism uses as a model, whether we should really consider this as something that we can learn from. The question that I have here is whether the improvised character of the movement strategy actually had an effect on its content, so its economic and political principles, which do seem equally improvised, chaotic, and if we look at the impact that they've had on our society today, very much ill-considered. So if we want to avoid this, is it necessary to not only challenge neoliberalism on its economic and political principles, but also on its principles of movement building? A final challenge that I'd like to address pertains to another prerequisite for a hegemonic paradigm shift, and that's recognized in this kind of more general critical political economy framework, and this is the ability to generate consent to the new hegemonic order among populations. Degrowth faces a big challenge in winning the consent of populations of wealthy, overdeveloped countries with large middle classes, where it is actually most vital that its policies are implemented first. What political strategy, I wonder, will it take to convince these populations that lowering levels of consumption and production, so this is a drastic change that will in all likelihood be experienced as a loss, at least at first. What strategy would be adequate for this? So even if it means that we gain more solidarity, more autonomy, or more freedom from climate breakdown in general, it seems sometimes like degrowth has bitten off more than it can chew in terms of this very ambitious idea of finding a way to convince people that they can have well-being without the consumption that we're used to. We can also speculate that left accelerationism might face a challenge in generating consent. So in the event that it does become hegemonic but doesn't re-articulate its principles to create adequate responses to climate collapse, in line with his scientific consensus on the impossibility of preventing catastrophic warming without drastically lowering energy demand in the global north. It might be easier for left accelerationism to win consent at first with its techno-utopian vision that doesn't place limits on consumption, but the question is then whether this consent will be easy to maintain if climate breakdown drives down quality of life in a way that we can't control anymore. So I want to end the talk with these kind of underlying questions, and it'd be great to come back to them in the open discussion, which we'll have afterwards. But for now, I'd like to just take a break, and thank you all for listening. Thank you.